Hi everybody, and welcome to video number 2 in our Old Testament series. Today we're going to be getting started on our Old Testament survey, or our overview of the Old Testament. It's going to be really quick. We're going to get it done over 2 days. Now we may go a few minutes over into the third day, part of the third day study, but I don't think so. I think we're going to be able to get it done in just 2 days. But if we don't, it's no worry. It won't be more than a few minutes out of the following day's study. Now, one of the first things that I would like to do, and this list will be on Facebook for you, so please look for it there amongst the postings. But we're going to talk about an Old Testament events watch list. Put these on a piece of paper, do whatever you need to do, and during our entire Old Testament survey and then later on during our studies, keep this list handy. It will help you to rightly divide define things, and it will also help you just to kind of look at the major events and what is it that you need to be looking for next. It helps you weed your way through and organize your Old Testament studies. There's many other just, if not more important events than these than those that I have listed on this watch list. But the thing about these particular events is they're going to serve as a type of bookmark for you as you go, and as I said, help you not only with our studies but with future studies with other teachers as you delve in deeper. So the list of events that I want you to keep in mind, there's a whole list of, I could have come up with more, but I needed to limit it. So there's like 15 events here that I would like for you to keep your eye open and where they occur. So as we go through our studies, I want you to put a verse beside the number as to where this event occurred. So for instance, number 1, year 0, the Earth's creation/recreation, and the creation of all that populates it, from the tiniest little insect to the first human beings, Adam and Eve, and all that's contained within this earth and all that surrounds this earth. So that you would be putting down beside the number 1 where this event occurs at. And then, the second event, which is kind of combined with the first one, but basically it's the creation of Adam and Eve and their disobedience, falling out of the will of God, and their subsequently being expelled from the garden. Event number 3 is the first murder. It's not the first sin, but it is the first murder. And then event number 4 is the earth increases in population, but at the same time the earth is increasing in population, there's also man simultaneously. They're falling from the grace of God at the same time. And there's some of these events that don't just happen in one pinpointed place. It happens over a series of places. So you may find yourself listing more than one verse there, but it's the event that you're looking for. Number 5, then we're going to have the flood and the subsequent repopulation. I'm using the word subsequent a lot, but it's a good fallback word for me. Then the Tower of Babel, and once again the subsequent scattering of the people all over the earth. Then we have Abraham's conversion. Abraham's father was an idol worshiper. Abraham realized that there was only one God, so he became monotheistic, which is a word that means only one God. Polytheistic means there's multitudes of different gods. So Adam converted to monotheism, and this was the beginning of the Hebrew people. Then the man named Israel for our 8th marker. The man named Israel and his family had to move to Egypt to avoid a drought, so they could feed them. He could feed this family. That is our 8th marker. Then the 9th marker is the nation of Israel, or the descendants, the family of this man Israel, become enslaved. They are enslaved and used for hard labor by the people of Egypt. Then our number 10 marker is the Exodus and the subsequent wanderings that followed their leaving Egypt. Our 11th marker is the Davidic kingdom. Now, there was a kingdom before David. There was one other monarchy before David. But for the purposes of our markers, it's the Davidic kingdom. Then we have the 13th marker, which is Assyria conquers Israel. Now, Israel was the northern kingdom at the period of time this event happens, or that land was called Samaria later on. Now, our 14th marker, which occurs really just shortly after the 13th marker, it's not very much time that goes by at all, is Babylon conquers Judah. The temple is destroyed. Judah becomes into exile, and Judah that time occupied the southern kingdom, which included Jerusalem, and that was called the land of Judah. Now, our 15th and final marker is Judah returns from exile and the temple is rebuilt. So those are markers that I would like for you to remember. Just keep a piece of paper with them handy as we study the Old Testament. And you're going to discover, I'm going to advise you keep several pieces of paper handy. So if you want those things that you need to keep handy for a long period of time to kind of be durable, because this study is not going to take just 1 month. This is a long-term study of the Bible. We'll be going back and forth between the New Testament and the Old Testament. Write them on something that's reasonably heavy that'll last you all that time. Now we are going to get in. Now that we've gotten our list, we're going to get into our Old Testament survey or overview, as I've already mentioned. Now, what are our course objectives for this Old Testament survey? Number one, it's to understand the chronological order of the Old Testament. Number two, we need to be able to explain to other people and to understand ourselves first all of the basic Old Testament information. Number three, we need to be able to pinpoint events of the greatest importance. And the reasoning for that leads us to our number 4 objective, because we need to feel comfortable looking around the Old Testament for events, trying to teach other people about these events, and any other things that are contained within the Old Testament. We just do not want it to seem so overwhelming to us. And so that's the course objectives of the Old Testament survey or overview, is to show you it's really nothing to be alarmed about, or there's nothing to be nervous about when it comes to studying the Old Testament. Now, another thing I would like to talk about is the arrangement of the Old Testament as compared to a Hebrew Old Testament, or you might refer to it as a Jewish Old Testament. First of all, you need to really understand that both versions of the Old Testament are exactly the same. They sound different, but they're exactly the same. They contain the same words, the same information. Okay? Now, the differences are kind of superficial, important to some. Others, they're not that big of a deal. Some of the differences just make it more complicated for us. But basically, just remember that the Christian Old Testament has 39 books in it. The Hebrew Old Testament has only 24 books in it. Once again, they're the same. It all has to do with how it's arranged. For instance, one of the ways for me to explain this is that look at the book of Kings. In the Christian Bible, that is 2 books, Kings 1 and Kings 2. In the Hebrew Old Testament, it's just simply the book of Kings. It was never divided into 2 books. And there's other books like that. 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Hebrew Old Testament was never divided. And there are others, but those are the 2 main ones that we look at quite a bit. Now, the other thing that's different is really in a title. One of the other things, and that's what we call the first 5 books of the Bible. We seem to agree that there are a special group of books, the first 5 books, but we call them something different. So the first 5 books are the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, in the Christian Old Testament, it is called the Pentateuch. And please forgive my pronunciation of a lot of words that we're about to discuss today and in the future. Now, in the Hebrew Old Testament, that is called the Torah. Okay, that means the law. Now, another difference is there's more divisions in the Bible, in the Christian Old Testament. So the Christians have 5 different divisions of the Bible. One of them we've already discussed, and that is the Pentateuch. Then they divide it into the historical books. The historical books, Samuel 1 and 2, Joshua, Judges, Kings 1 and 2, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Then our third group of them are the poetry and wisdom books. That's Job, which, by the way, Job is the oldest book in the Bible. Its events occur at the same time as Genesis do, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a moment. But the authorship of it, the pen was taken to paper before the book of Moses ever wrote the book of Genesis. But it's a book of poetry and wisdom. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And when we're talking about these divisions, that is what is handy about these dividers that I told you about yesterday. These are color-coded according to these sections. Now, as complicated as these sections do make looking through the Bible, it also helps you to find things easier. So even though it's more complicated than the Hebrew version or the way the Hebrew Bible is divided, a positive thing about it is that you can find things easier if you think about the Old Testament in divisions. But these divisions in no way make it chronological. Okay? So that we talked about the third group, which is the poetry and wisdom. The fourth group would be called major prophets. Now, I will agree with the Hebrew scholars in that I don't see why they were called major and minor prophets. I don't understand that yet. Maybe somewhere in my studies in the future I will figure out why some were called minor prophets. But anyway, those that are considered the major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah. Lamentations is listed as one of the major prophetic books. To me, seems like it belongs in the poetry and wisdom, and we'll talk about that at some other point. But anyway, it was written by Jeremiah. But it's considered part of the major prophets. Then we have Ezekiel and Daniel. And then we come to the minor prophets, which are Haggai, Malachi, Nahum, someone I never can say, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, and Micah. Those are all considered the minor prophets. So in the Christian Old Testament, there are 5 sections. Now in the Hebrew Old Testament, there are just 3, and one of them we already talked about, and that is the Torah. Now these other 2 sections, I have no doubt that I'm not saying them correctly, so please excuse me, any of those that do know how to say it. But the first one is the Nebiim, the second one, the Nebiim, and that is all the prophets together. They didn't subdivide out the prophets at all. And then the third one is called the Kettim, and that's all the other writings. So you have the Torah, the law, then you have the Nebiim, the prophets, and then you have the Kettim, which is all the other writings in the Old Testament. Now, one thing I would like to point out before we go any further is if you're talking to a Messianic Jew or an Orthodox Jew, a Christian Jew or a non-Christian Jew, they really, many are quite insulted if you by your calling the Old Testament the Old Testament. In other words, they do not consider it old at all. They consider it just written before the New Testament. Many of them will refer to it as the First Testament and the New Testament as the Second Testament. And I can see their point, but part of their problem with it is by us calling it the Old Testament, and if you listen to a lot of the teachings out there right now, I can see why they think this, is that Christians discount the Old Testament. They not all do, and I don't mean that, but a lot of teachers, I even heard one teacher on television some time ago say, he was talking about the Old Testament, he just said, it's bad, it's just bad. And that was his exact words. And, that's not true. And so when you hear things like that happening, you can totally understand where they're coming from by them not appreciating us calling it that. Now, what they call it in their original, the Hebrew Bible is officially called, is the Tanakh. Tenach, the Tanakh. So that is what the Hebrew Bible is officially called. Okay, now, and I bring that up because there are a lot of Messianic teachers that are coming and guest speaking in our denominational churches now. You'll see them on television, and I think this is a good thing because it is very important that we understand our Hebrew roots. So I think if they use different terminology, you need to understand it's just different terminology or different divisions. Now, before we go any further, I want to talk about timelines in the Bible. And basically what I mean by that is BC, before Christ, AD, after Christ. Let's say you draw a line, and in the middle there's a line down this way, and that would be representational of the time, when Christ was born. Anything before that is considered BC, before Christ. Anything after that, AD, that's after Christ. I think officially that means after death, but really anything after Christ is considered AD. After the birth of Christ is considered AD. You notice that the further away, no matter where on the timeline you are, the further away you get from that center line where Christ was born, the bigger the numbers get. So for instance, if you're all the way in the beginning of the Old Testament, at the creation of the earth, 5,000 years ago from now, let's say we're 3,000 years away from the birth of Christ. That means that is the year 3000. Okay? Then the closer you get, the numbers get smaller because you're getting closer only until, like if you're 10 years before the birth of Christ, that's 10 BC, 10 years before Christ. So then we hit the birth of Christ, and then everything else is after Christ, and then the numbers get bigger. So the further away from the birth of Christ you get, the numbers get bigger. Right now we are 2,017 years after Christ. Okay? So and the reason that I bring that up is I noticed in another study group that I study with sometimes that some people didn't understand that, because plus those terms are not commonly taught anymore. But we are a Christian Bible study group. We'll be using the Christian terms for that. Now, I did a study with, and some of you guys may be interested. That's why I'm going to show it to you. It's called the Institute of Jewish and Christian Studies, and their goal is to help us to understand our Hebraic roots, to our faith. And part of that study had an Old Testament survey to it, and by the way, if you're interested in this, just Google Institute of Jewish Christian Studies, and you can see it's kind of expensive. It took me, I don't remember the exact time frame, but it was over 6 months to complete it. It's a very in-depth study, but I just loved it. But it is expensive. It's about $500. It comes with multiple notebooks like this. I don't remember how many total are with it. If you want, you can send it in and get a certificate. I did all the tests, but I never did send them in and get the certificate. But anyway, the thing that I learned a lot from the two of the different sections in there especially. And one was the Old Testament survey and the other was the New Testament survey. And I've done other surveys, but the reason that I so liked this Old Testament survey, which is the one we're talking about now, was the way that they had it organized to help you find your way around the Old Testament or the Tanakh, and to make it easier for you to study it and not feel so intimidated by it. And so I'm going to do it a similar way. I am borrowing their way of organizing the study. Now my study is quite different than theirs, but yet at the same time, those that have done that study with them will recognize this. Now, first of all, I want you to remember, and this listing is posted on Facebook, the foundational books of the Old Testament. These are 11 books that are that form the basic foundation of the Old Testament. All the other books are like supportive actors in a movie. They support these 11 foundational books. All the events that happen in those other books, while they are no less important, they are supportive and occur during the times of these 11 books. Now, so I'm just going to name them one by one, and then later on we'll talk a little bit more about them. The first one is Genesis, number 2, Exodus, number 3, Numbers, number 4, Joshua, number 5, Judges, number 6 and 7 are 1st and 2nd Samuel, number 8 and 9 are 1st and 2nd Kings, number 10 is Ezra, and number 11 is Nehemiah. Now, these books are further subdivided into 3 major divisions. Now, these divisions have to do with events and time frames. So, for instance, the first division is called the Formation. Now, the Formation will include any books that include occurrences that happen sometime between the creation all the way to the formation of Judaism as a religion. So that would include them going to that would include the creation all the way to the time they go to the Promised Land, and ultimately the creation of the religion of Judaism. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, and Judges. Now, the next 2 books, or the next section, the second of the 3 major divisions, is called the Monarchy, and this is the monarchy period of Israel. And this is called this because at some point towards the end of the age of Judges, and we'll go into a lot more detail about that later in the next day or so, but towards the end of the period of Judges, the people of Israel decided they no longer wanted a kingdom ruled by God. They were out of the will of God, even though they were still united as a tribe, as a kingdom underneath 12 tribes. They still really were not under the will of God. And there was a lot going on, and we'll talk about that when we get in depth to the book studies. But so they wanted a king. So God said, okay, we're going to have a king, and or a monarchy. So this period of the monarchies can be further subdivided because there was a time when they were united under the kings. And then there was another time where they came into disagreement and they were divided under the kings. So the monarchy is further subdivided into the united monarchy, which that is what occurs in Samuel 1 and 2. And then the divided monarchy, where they were no longer all together as a full 12 tribes. And that is Kings 1 and 2 is where that occurs at. Now, there's a period of time between the monarchy and our 3rd major division. And that 3rd major division is called the post-exilic division. And what happens in that period of time is the tribe of Judah goes into exile in Babylon. There's tons of other events that we need to cover, but that is one of the major events that they go into exile. And then this post-exilic period is following the Babylonian exile. The tribe of Judah is allowed, if they want to return to the land of Judah and rebuild their destroyed temple and repopulate their land. And so that is known as the post-exilic period, the post-exile. And the books that cover that are Ezra and Nehemiah. So those are our 11 foundational books. We start with those 11 foundational books as we study the Old Testament, and then we will gradually add in the other books. Okay, now we have time. We're gonna go ahead and get started on the first discussion of our overview of our first book, and that is Genesis. Genesis was written by Moses somewhere around the year 1450 to 1410 BC. And it's called the Book of Beginnings. That's another name for it. The name Genesis is actually a Greek name that means the beginnings. but it covers about 2,500 years. As I said, it was not the first book in the Bible. Job was actually the first book ever written that we know of in the Bible, but this is the major book about the events during that time. Then there's a couple of different things. There's a lot of events. An awful lot happens in the book of Genesis. But I want you to note a couple of things, and it'll encompass everything for you, the main crux of what we're looking at in Genesis. Chapters 1 through 11 are about the beginnings of everything, the beginnings of life. And then chapter 12 is where we have the beginnings of Israel. Doesn't mean necessarily that they are Israel yet, but it is the beginnings of Israel. As a matter of fact, Genesis actually tells us, because it does introduce us to Israel once they are called Israel, and it tells exactly who Israel is and who all went in to the land of Egypt, so we know who exactly the people of Israel are descended from. And you'll note that that's a big theme leading up to that in that particular book is Israel and how Israel came to be. Now then, we're also going to have time to talk about our brief overview of the book of Exodus. Now, Exodus is primarily about names. I mean, there's a lot that happens in Exodus once again. Any of you that saw the movie, The Ten Commandments, know a lot happens in Exodus. But it basically covers a time span of about 80 years. It was written during the same years, somewhere in that general time frame as Genesis was written. But so 1450 to 1410. But it only covers about an 80-year span of time. And it gives us the exact names of those people groups that left Egypt, it just kind of briefly describes what is happening to the people during their enslavement in Egypt, and that's the very first part of it. And then it goes into the life of Moses, first including his time and him being raised in Egypt, his exile. He's back in Egypt again, and then we have the Exodus. Now, there are some things that you're going to need to pay particular attention to in that book, and one of them starts in chapter 10, and that is when the Exodus actually begins. The first 10 chapters of the book of Exodus are events. They all occur while they're still in Egypt. Then chapter 10 is when they actually leave Egypt, and then after that we have the events at Sinai. And the events in Sinai are very, very important because they lead to things that affect our lives today and how we live our lives today. Now, all of this occurred from chapter 10, the Exodus, through the events in Sinai. All of that occurs after only over about a year's period of time. Now, then if you look at the period of time that they left Egypt until they arrived at the borders of the land of Canaan, that was about 2 to 3 years from the time they left Egypt, somewhere in that time frame. Now, they spent about 37 years wandering around in that desert, all because of their falling from out of the will of God. God had a job that he needed for them to do in the land of Canaan. And they fell so far out of the will of God that they were not going to complete that job. Moses even wasn't doing things how God needed them to be done, and so he subsequently wasn't allowed to go into the promised land either. And although he was pretty old by the time they got there, he wasn't allowed to go in there because of his own sin, because of his own disobeying his heavenly Father. He loved him, but he had to suffer the consequences of his sin, and that's something you're going to see throughout the Bible. Another thing that you need to note is what they carried around with them as they went through the desert. They carried around the tabernacle and all of its contents, and we're going to discuss that because that also has a big impact. And you need to remember that the tabernacle was not a temple, and we'll go into more detail with that later. It was a place of worship and sacrifice, but it was not considered a temple, and we'll go into that later. Now that we're out of time today, I want to let you know and remind you once again that we are all in the service of our Heavenly Father. And please spend some time praying about what you learned today, and what God would have you glean from that. And just remember that I love you, and I will see you all tomorrow for tomorrow's study. Look for the listing of the Old Testament watch list, and also about the 11 books and the 3 divisions of those 11 books. Those will be posted on Facebook so that you can make your own list up of those. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.